in the capital city of Kyiv. And these explosions are said to be because of missile strikes. It remains to be seen as to what happens in the next few hours from now in terms of the escalation that is quite clearly underway in Ukraine. And also to give us more insights in terms of how this conflict, of course, could play out, we are joined in by Mr. Spencer Critchley, who's the author of Patriots of Two Nations, who's joining us live on this broadcast all the way from California. Now, Mr. Critchley, this, of course, is the moment of truth for the West. For the last several weeks now, the West was engaged in hectic diplomacy in a bid to try and shore up support for the Ukrainians. But now that push has come to shove, it appears that Ukraine virtually is on its own to face the Russian onslaught.
Yes, it's extremely disturbing. I think the whole democratic world, at least, needs to take this with the utmost seriousness. This is a civilizational moment in history, I would say. To the extent that we have made progress over the course of human history, it's been that we have moved away, however haltingly, from behavior like this, from a world built on lies and the raw exercise of power, towards one which, since the end of the Second World War, for all of the terrible things that have happened, has been far better than human history beforehand, because we have established a democratic world order across much of the world where we do things like respect each other's boundaries and do not stage military invasions just because we want to take over somebody else's country on some obvious pretext.
Now, at this point of time, Mr. Critchley, for people who've been following this crisis unfold, this is not something that has happened, out of the blue. There was a clear preparation that was done by the Russians. Since November, there was a steady increase in terms of troops that Russia was putting in place to virtually encircle Ukraine. And the West was, of course, engaged in a lot of diplomacy, and all of that has come to a naught. At this point of time, how do you think the West will, of course, respond to this incursion by the Russians in the Donbas region at this point of time?
Yes, and I would just note, I think actually Vladimir Putin has been preparing for this since he gained power. He's been telling us what he believes in, and he's been following up on what he believes in. And what he believes in is reestablishing a Russian empire that fills out the former boundaries of the Soviet Union, which the Ukraine was never a voluntary part of. Let's remember, Ukraine had a horrible experience under Soviet domination, including the loss of millions upon millions of lives during an engineered famine. There is no sense in which they want to be conquered by the Ukraine. I think that President Biden and the NATO alliance are clear on that, and I've been heartened to see the resolve and focus that they've brought to their response so far. One of the reasons I think that liberal democracy is in trouble around the world is that because it's based on negotiation and because it's based on the Enlightenment tradition of reason, sometimes it lacks that focus and that sense of passion, belief, and commitment that people draw from ethnic nationalism, in the case of Russia, for example, sometimes from religious fanaticism. But as the poem goes, sometimes you find that the best lack all resolve, and all of the commitment is coming from the worst of people. I'm very heartened to see that President Biden and the Western Alliance are showing the kind of resolve that I think we need to show in order to stand up to what is just raw aggression.
Absolutely, indeed. It is a raw aggression, but, people within Ukraine would, of course, question the resolve of the West and indeed the United States and its allies in creating a deterrence to stave off this round of aggression by the Russians. Do you think, there was a lack of unity in terms of the United States and its European allies in creating a financial deterrence? And financial deterrence alone may not have deterred Russia from resorting to the actions that it is now indulging in, because not every one of the American allies was on board in terms of imposing financial costs. Germany was not completely convinced about cutting off Russia from the world banking system. And these are some clear issues in terms of lack of unity in the West's response to the troop build-up by the Russians.
I wouldn't characterize it as a lack of unity. I'd say it's not ideal unity, but I don't think ideal unity is achievable, especially when you're dealing with democracy and respect for independent nations. But I have been impressed that Russia, for example, terminated the Nord Stream pipeline. These are significant moves. The targeting of oligarchs and their families and their ability to enjoy the luxuries of world capitals like London and incredible vacation destinations like Lake Como, and enrolling their children in elite private schools, enjoying all the benefits of Western liberal democracy while trying to overthrow it at the same time. I think that's entirely appropriate. So I have been impressed, though, that although the unity is not ideal, I think it's been strong. I also think it's very appropriate to do these financial sanctions in as targeted a way as possible, to go after the gangsters who are ruling Russia and robbing its people blind. There will be no way to avoid causing suffering to the Russian people, unfortunately, but targeting the kleptocrats who have been looting the Russian treasury for decades now, I think is entirely appropriate. And we must hope that the Russian people have some access still to non-propaganda sources of news, so they can get the idea that this is not about the Russian people. This is about the gangsters who are essentially occupying their country and looting it.
Interesting how you've described this kleptocrats. Do continue to stay on with us, but we want to talk a bit about the visuals that we are getting from the city of Kharkiv, because there are clear signs of what we see are explosions that have taken place in Kharkiv. These are the latest visuals that we are getting from the city of Kharkiv. This is what the skyline looks like at this point of time. And we can also play the other visual from the city of Kharkiv, which showed a big bang and a flash of light in the Kharkiv airspace. This is what the skyline looks like at this point of time. And according to reports that have come in Kyiv, there have been explosions that are being attributed to missile strikes. That is what is being said. This is, of course, a developing story. We'll, of course, be getting you the updates as they emerge in terms of what is happening in terms of the military onslaught that's now been announced by the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Mr. Critchley, you mentioned something very interesting in terms of how, you said that this was a dream of Vladimir Putin, that he's been dreaming about ever since he's been at the helm of affairs in Russia for the last 2 decades now, more than 2 decades now. But the question, of course, is that of how much of conflict, what is the Russian appetite for a conflict in this case? In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. Now, Russia has recognized the breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent republics. Is the Donbas region the focus of the Russian aggression here, or do you think this could be a bigger conflict that could spill over into the rest of Ukraine and indeed into the rest of Europe?
I think we have to assume that that's the plan. Every indication has pointed in that direction all the way along. President Putin, with his incursions into Crimea, into Georgia, into Ukraine, especially after 2014, after the crook, the puppet essentially, who was running Ukraine on behalf of Russia at that time, was ejected by the people of Ukraine. And so we have to assume, we can't know, but I think we have to assume that his ambition is to continue into Eastern Europe and start to take back countries, including countries in Eastern Europe that have joined NATO in the meantime. I just think he considers that to be completely unacceptable. I think also Westerners, again, because of this tradition of liberal democracy based in the tradition of Enlightenment reason, tend to take a utilitarian approach to decision-making, and I think they lose track of the fundamental division in worldview that exists in our time. And that division in worldview exists in the United States now as well. It's actually the subject of my book. And what President Putin represents, I think, is a counter-Enlightenment worldview that goes back 1,000 years in Russia. You can go back to the split between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, which then migrated north to become the Russian Orthodox Church. It's a very different worldview, and it's built much more on a sense of mystical destiny than some kind of utilitarian cost-benefit analysis, which tends to typify the Western liberal democracy approach to things. So this is why somebody like Putin appears to be so irrational and is irrational, but he's operating within a different worldview. I think that's something that he has in common with one of his top admirers, former President Trump, who operates within that same worldview. It's much more the worldview of a warlord than a modern leader of a legitimate democracy.
Absolutely, indeed, Mr. Critchley. Do stay on with us because we want to talk a bit about the visuals that we are getting from the city of Kharkiv. These are the big flashbangs that we are looking at on our screens. If we could go back to the other visual that showed a clear lighting up of the sky in Kharkiv. These are the latest visuals. At this point of time, it is not very clear as to what exactly is happening. Is this another missile strike, perhaps, that has taken place? Ukraine, for its part, has closed off its airspace. And the Ukrainian foreign minister has said that this is not a limited operation. This is a full-scale invasion by the Russians into Ukrainian territory. This is what is now going to worry people who are looking at this crisis, because this looks very serious in terms of the visuals that we are getting in. More information, of course, is awaited in terms of what's exactly happening at this point of time in Kharkiv and also in the capital city of Kyiv. And the Russian President Vladimir Putin, when he made that statement, he said military operation in the Donbas region. The Russians, he said, are moving in to establish peace and for peaceful purposes. But for people who've been watching this crisis unfold for the last several weeks, and indeed from the middle of November last year, the Russian intentions at this point of time clearly point to the possibility of a much bigger conflict. Mr. Critchley, these visuals that we are getting at this point of time, it is not very clear as to what is the extent of damage. These, it's not very clear in terms of what is this? Is this an explosion? Is this a missile strike? But these are, of course, pretty concerning in terms of what is happening at this point of time in Ukraine. And to go back to the question of the Russian demands for security guarantees, Russia has been asking that Ukraine should not be made a member of the NATO military alliance, while the West, led by the United States and its NATO allies, has been not willing to immediately admit Ukraine into the NATO military alliance for a whole variety of reasons. But the fact of the matter is, we are looking at the dismemberment of the Ukrainian nation as it exists. In 2014, Russia attacked and annexed Crimea, and now we are looking at the Donbas region, which has been recognized as an independent region by the Russians. Is the West sleepwalking its way into the dismemberment of the Ukrainian nation?
I don't think they're sleepwalking. This is, though, an extremely difficult position if you're fighting on the side of maintaining civilization as opposed to just participating in the worldwide descent into barbarism that I think Putin seems to be after. Ukraine is not yet a member of NATO, and the United States has to be extremely careful about deciding to do a military involvement in a nation that it doesn't have a military alliance with. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that the United States has always gotten that kind of decision-making right. We've made some terrible mistakes in that area. But that has to play into it if we're fighting, as I say, on the side of civilization where, basically since 1648, in the Peace of Westphalia, we've at least committed to the idea of respecting national boundaries, and certainly since the creation of the world order following World War II, where it's supposed to be founded on the respect for mutual respect for boundaries. So it's a fiendishly difficult problem, but I think that there are ways to respond aggressively without the United States or NATO forces directly entering Ukraine. Now, that's a terrible situation for the Ukrainian people to be in, and no doubt one more tragedy in a very tragic history. A tragic history for the Russian people as well, again, under the oppression either of their own leaders, as under the Soviet Union and currently under President Putin, or under invaders like the Nazis or Bonaparte or whoever. And it's always, unfortunately, it's the regular people who have to bear all of this terrible suffering because of the aggressive actions of bad leaders.
Now, Mr. Critchley, you've been a commentator on American politics very closely. So the question that I want to ask you is more to do with how the United States will, of course, respond to this crisis. Ukraine is not a part of the NATO military alliance, so NATO is not duty-bound to militarily help out Ukraine. But the United States is, of course, shipping some amount of military hardware for the Ukrainian army to fight with. But within the United States of America, do you think there is any appetite for the Biden administration to get involved in a conflict whose consequences at this point of time are difficult to comprehend?
I would have to assume there'd be a great deal of reluctance, especially after our recent history in Iraq and Afghanistan. Americans, especially, again, ordinary Americans, the kind of people who send their sons and daughters and husbands and wives off to fight these wars, have paid a terrible price, often for reasons that are not clear, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the idea of getting involved in another foreign war where it's not clear what the direct interest of the United States is, and remember, this is a country that was founded on, in part on the principle of avoiding foreign entanglements. That was important to the founders. They didn't want to become the Europe of the time, constantly fighting wars. Right. So there's all kinds of reasons why Americans would be reluctant to that. And then we have to add on to that the difficulty we're facing with the fragmentation of our own media, so that a significant portion of our population gets all of its news from what amounts to the equivalent of Russian propaganda channels in these news channels and websites and social media feeds that purport to be news but are nothing more than propaganda, and are very often directly taking talking points from Russian media and Russian intelligence services. So it's an extremely difficult problem. But I do think President Biden understands all of this very well. And I've been, as I say, very impressed with his resolve and focus so far. So I don't expect him to back off. I think he will respond to this aggressively, but not belligerently, and intelligently in multiple ways.
All right, very interesting how Biden responds to this gauntlet by the Russian president. That, of course, is what we will be looking at in the next few very crucial hours to come. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Spencer Critchley, for joining us all the way from California and getting us all those insights on this developing story.